Glorious devotees, thank you for viewing another presentation on Sri Visvanatha Cakravarti Ṭhakura's Sri Madhurya Kadambini, the Monsoon Clouds of Sweetness. We're in the section of Sri Madhurya Kadambini dealing with the clearing of anarthas, and this presentation will deal with the various categories of Jivas as they relate to the offense of considering Lord Shiva and Lord Vishnu as being the same or as being different. We'll begin here with a discussion of the various divisions of sentient beings. Chaitanya Tattva, the ontology of sentient beings. Sentient beings fall into two categories: independent, which would be the all-pervading Lord, and dependent, the minute living entities. We've discussed the independent, all-pervading Lord to some extent in previous discussions. Those manifestations include Narayan and other manifestations of the Lord that remain untouched by Maya. Also within that category is Shiva, who voluntarily accepts the touch of Maya. We will continue now with a discussion of the dependent, minute living entities. They also fall into two categories: those that are covered by ignorance and those that are not covered by ignorance. Sentient beings controlled by Ishvara, the Supreme Lord, are known as Jivas. They are classified in two ways, according to their condition: those covered by ignorance and those not covered by ignorance. Sentient beings not covered by ignorance are also of two types: those invested with the Lord's potency of divine majesty and those not invested with that potency. For the reader to understand the difference between Lord Shiva, who is counted as a manifestation of the Lord, and Sri Brahma, who is counted as a living entity, Srila Visvanatha Cakravarti Ṭhakura first differentiates between the two types of sentient living entities, independent and dependent. These dependent sentient entities are further divided into two classes: those engrossed in ignorance and those not engrossed in ignorance. And of course, those that are engrossed in ignorance fall into the categories of the demigods, the human beings, birds, animals, plant life, and other living entities. Those engrossed in ignorance, or avidya, are confronted with a covering of the five kleshas, beginning, of course, with ignorance itself, followed by false ego, asmita, raga, dvesha, attachment and hatred, and abhinivesha, fear of death. So that gives us an overview of those dependent living entities covered by ignorance. We will continue now by looking at those that are not covered by ignorance. They also fall into two categories: those not invested with the Lord's Aishvarya Shakti, his opulence potency, and those that are invested with his Aishvarya Shakti. Those that are not so invested with his personal Shakti of Aishvarya fall into two categories. Remember, we're speaking of those that are not covered by ignorance. The first is the Jnani, who merges with Nirguna or Saguna Brahma, and, of course, the Bhaktas, who relish the sweetness of the names, forms, qualities, and pastimes of Sri Bhagavan. The second type of sentient beings are not engrossed in ignorance. They are further divided into two types: those invested with the Lord's potency of divine majesty, Aishvarya Shakti, who perform superhuman acts, and those not invested with that potency. Viswanath continues in his Madhurya Kadambini, the sentient beings who do not possess the potency of divine majesty can be broadly characterized into two groups: those who have merged into Aishwarya through the cultivation of Gyan, and those who have not merged with him and have been established in eternal servitude. The sentient beings in the former category are in a deplorable state. The sentient beings in the latter category can taste the Lord's Madhurya, so they are not at all pitiful, but full of transcendental bliss. Jivas liberated from ignorance. The Jnani merges with Brahman, but the Bhakta relishes the charming sweetness of Bhagavan. Those not invested with the Lord's potency of divine majesty are also of two types. The first are those who cultivate Brahma Gyan, thinking themselves to be one with transcendence. Such living entities merge with the featureless aspect of the absolute truth, Nirvishesh Brahman. That is, they attain Sayuja Mukti. Some achieve Ishvara Sayuja, meaning that they merge with the form of the Lord, who is replete with divine attributes. We should understand that even though the Jnanis think themselves to be Brahman, they cannot possibly become Brahman. Their separate existence remains because they are not independent sentient beings, but eternally dependent sentient beings. They are not personal expansions of the Lord, Swamsa. Rather, they are eternally separated, Vibhi Namsa. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya explains the following. There are two kinds of Sayuja Mukti, merging into the Brahman effulgence and merging into the personal body of the Lord. Merging into the Lord's body is even more abominable than merging into his effulgence. The second type of sentient entity that is not invested with the Lord's Shakti practices bhakti in moods such as servitude and friendship. He attains the Supreme Lord in the form of his servant, friend, and so on. He thus becomes fortunate to relish the immense, inexhaustible sweetness of Sri Bhagavan. Such a pure devotee would rather go to hell than merge into the effulgence of the Lord. We'll now move on to a discussion of the minute living entities who are invested with the Lord's Aishwarya Shakti. These also fall into two categories: invested with the Chit Shakti, an aspect of transcendence, such as the four Kumars, and invested with the creative potency, an aspect of Maya, such as Lord Brahma. We should remember that these are broad characterizations of the various living entities who are invested with the Lord's innumerable potencies. Viswanath continues, sentient beings empowered with divine majesty are also of two types: those who are empowered with knowledge arising from an aspect of the internal potency of the Lord, Chit Shakti, and those who are invested with the creative potency which arises from an aspect of the illusory energy, Maya Shakti. The former category includes the four sons born from the mind of Brahma, namely Chatu Sana, Sanaka, Sanatan, Sanandana, and Sanat Kumar. The latter category includes Brahma and others. Those invested with the Lord's Aishwarya Shakti are also of two types. The first are invested with the Lord's transcendental internal Chit Shakti, the Lord's divine, majestic potency of transcendental knowledge. Examples are the four sons from the mind of Lord Brahma, Sanaka, Sanandana, Sanatan, and Sanat Kumar. Being always immersed in transcendental knowledge of Sri Hari, they wander here and there, unconnected to the creation of the material universe. The second type are invested with a portion of the Lord's external Maya Shakti to perform acts such as creation. This refers to Lord Brahma, the grandfather of this universe, whom Sri Bhagavan invests with his Maya Shakti to accomplish the creation of the material world. In Sri Bhagavatamrita Kana, Sri Visvanatha has identified the 4 Kumars as Leela avatars, pastime expansions, and Sri Brahma as Guna avatar. In this way, the ontology of sentient beings can be easily understood. Vishwanath continues, only Sri Vishnu is to be worshipped. As they are both in the category of independent controllers, it is established conclusively that Sri Vishnu and Lord Shiva are non-different. Nevertheless, for the practitioner who is free from material desires, the subject of who is to be worshipped and who is not to be worshipped should be discerned after careful deliberating upon the object of worship's nirgunatva or sagunatva, attribute of being beyond material nature or within material nature. Sri Visvanatha Cakravarti Ṭhakura has established the oneness of Sri Vishnu and Lord Shiva from the perspective of their both being independent sentient beings, Ishvara Chaitanya. He now considers the matter further from the perspective of worship. A selfless sadhaka must determine his object of worship only after ascertaining whether or not his object of veneration is touched by the material modes. Sri Vishnu, for the sake of pastimes, has become Shiva, a Guna avatar. Sri Sadashiva, who resides in the Vaikuntha realm of Sadashiva Loka, is a special expansion of Sri Krishna himself and the origin of the Guna avatar, Shiva. Selfless sadhakas of bhakti do not have a trace of desire for any temporary illusory pleasures. They desire only the eternal treasure of prema. Leaving aside the worship of Shiva and Brahma, who are tinged by the material modes, they exclusively worship Sri Hari, who is transcendental and untouched by Maya. Kapitadev said, "My dear mother, despite being offered the various kinds of liberation, living on the same planet as me, Salokya, possessing the same opulence as me, Sarsti, residing near me, Samipya, possessing a form like mine, Sarupya, or merging into my effulgence, Ekatva or Sayuja, my pure devotees do not accept them. They desire only prema." Vishwanath continues, sometimes a jiva invested with the potency of Bhagavan becomes Shiva. The difference between Sri Vishnu and Brahma lies in their distinct types of sentience, an independent controller, Ishvara Chaitanya, and a dependent living entity, Jiva Chaitanya. In some places, Peronic statements highlight the non-difference between them, but it is to be understood that this is like the non-difference between the sun and the Surya Kanta Mani, a gemstone imbued with the sun's potency. In certain lifetimes of Brahma, Mahakalpas, a living entity invested with the potency of the Lord, Saktavish, attains the attributes of Shiva. That is, just as Lord Brahma is classed as a jiva, Lord Shiva is sometimes also classed as a jiva. It has been said in Hari Bhakti Vilas, anyone who sees the best of divine beings, Sri Narayan, to be the same as Rudra or Brahma, is certainly an atheist. This statement can be reconciled by considering Rudra to have the same characteristics as Brahma. Now we will go into a reconciliation of these various statements so that they can be understood in context. First, we'll deal with Lord Vishnu and Lord Shiva are non-different. The second Nam Aparad enjoins that those who see a difference between the names, forms, qualities, and pastimes of Lord Vishnu and those of Lord Shiva are offenders to the holy name. Then we also have the statement from the Hari Bhakti Vilas, one who considers Brahma and Rudra, Shiva, to be on an equal level with Lord Narayan, is certainly an atheist. These statements can be reconciled as follows. These statements refer to the fault of regarding that form of Shiva who is in the category of Ishvara as different from Sri Vishnu, or the fault of regarding that form of Shiva who is in the category of a Jiva as non-different from Sri Vishnu. Now reconciling the contradictory statements regarding Brahma. Lord Vishnu and Lord Brahma are non-different. Sometimes an expansion of Sri Hari may also assume the post of Brahma. In that age, Kalpa, in which there is no such qualified Jiva, Sri Hari personally takes the post of a Guna avatar, becoming Brahma and performing the work of creation. He is then called Hiranyagarbha Brahma, or that Brahma who is in the category of Ishvara. Regarding their difference, from the Bhagavatam, a Jiva who properly executes his occupational duty within the Varnashram Dharma system for 100 births without fruitive desire becomes qualified to occupy the post of Brahma. At the beginning of creation, a qualified Jiva manifests from the lotus navel of Garbhodakshai Vishnu and occupies the post of Brahma. Bhagavan invests him with the potency of creation. Vishwanath continues, clearing all confusion regarding the position of Lord Shiva and Lord Vishnu, the second offense to the holy name is avoided. Without thoroughly reflecting on the spiritual truths that have been described thus far, some persons could conjecture as follows. Sri Vishnu is the Supreme Lord, not Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva is the Supreme Lord, not Sri Vishnu. We are one-pointed worshippers of Sri Vishnu and will not even glance at Lord Shiva. We are one-pointed worshippers of Lord Shiva and will not even look towards Sri Vishnu. One whose intelligence is engrossed in debate in this way only makes offenses to the holy name. By the ordinance of Bhagavan, such an offender may obtain the association of an exalted saintly personality who is conversant with all spiritual truths. He then becomes enlightened on this topic and develops faith that the Swarup of Lord Shiva is non-different from that of Lord Vishnu. Following this, exclusively through Nam Sankirtan, he becomes free from his above-mentioned offense to the holy name. I want to sincerely thank you for taking your valuable time to view this presentation on Sri Madhurya Kadambini. I hope it has enthused and nourished your spiritual understanding, and hope that you will return and view additional presentations. Hare Krishna.